Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Virginia Thorley, and I'm introducing our keynote this morning. I'll just put my glasses on, I can't see without them. This morning we're fortunate to have Dr. Petra Buskins as our keynote, and her topic is Gillard's Dilemma, the Sexual Contract and Maternal Citizenship. Now, Petra is an honorary fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne, a psychotherapist in private practice and a freelance opinion writer. In fact, as recently as this morning, she has an article published, Wollstonecraft's Dilemma, Feminism and Identity Politics, which is published today in Aereo magazine. She's had an impressive publishing record, which continues, including her book, Modern Motherhood, which is on sale up there now. I'm going to pass you over to Petra without more ado.
Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to be here among friends and colleagues for 20 years now. So I want to say thank you so much to all the organisers, of course Sophie, who's done an amazing job, Cindy, Renata, Lisa, Mari. So there's been, a wonderful effort behind this. The placenta is absolutely fantastic, and it's great to see Andrea O'Reilly here, my lecturer from undergraduate women's studies, Renata Klein. It just feels fantastic to be here, and of course Joan. So thank you to all the wonderful maternal feminists and radical feminists who are here organising this conference and talking about motherhood. Okay. So this paper is a version of a paper that's coming out in a new book that I've got with my colleague Carla Pascoe-Lay called Australian Mothering, that'll be published later in the year or early next year by Palgrave. And we've got a series of wonderful authors, Australian historians and sociologists writing about motherhood. Okay. On October 9, 2012, only hours before Australia's first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard's historic misogyny speech, she signed off on legislation that would revoke key welfare benefits for single mothers. In righteous indignation, Gillard railed against the leader of the opposition, Tony Abbott. "I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man," she exhorted. "If he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives, he needs a mirror." Powerful rhetoric indeed, linked to a complicated backstory in which the Speaker of the House, Peter Slipper, had made lewd comments about female genitalia in a series of text messages to his aide. Tony Abbott, is that any better?
Thank you.
Tony Abbott was calling for Slipper's resignation on the grounds of his egregious sexism, but Gillard needed Slipper to hold on to her razor-thin majority. So the small story had Gillard defending sexism in the name of its critique, while the larger story was one of speaking truth to power. The speech went viral and to date has over 3 million views on YouTube. World leaders congratulated Gillard, and almost 2 years later, Hillary Clinton identified the speech as, quote, very striking. In keeping with its history-making qualities, the Macquarie Dictionary redefined the word misogyny from the conventional hatred of women to a fuller definition encompassing, quote, entrenched prejudices against women. While Australian journalists were focused on the small story of Peter Slipper and Gillard's compromised political position, international commentators were quick to grasp the historic import of Gillard's speech, which consisted in the formidable fact of a woman not just speaking truth to power, but speaking truth as power, perhaps more poignantly, using that power to dismantle the legacy of sexism. As Gillard stole the show with her acerbic rhetoric, few noticed, let alone commented on an equally significant event for Australian women on the same day: the destruction of welfare benefits for single parents, close to 85% of whom are women. This contrast strikes me as symbolic of something at the very heart of gender politics today: the discrepancy between women's standing as individuals, the apparently sexless persons of the social contract, and women's standing as mothers, a sexed and gendered identity if ever there was one. As Prime Minister Julia Gillard stormed the Parliament with her rousing speech, she signed off on the Social Security legislation amendment, Fair Incentives to Work Bill. This bill moved over 150,000 mothers off parenting payment single and onto an unemployment benefit the government called, without a hint of irony, New Start. This was most certainly a new start, one in which women's status as mothers bore no relation to their incorporation as citizens into the polity, a move already commenced under the former Liberal Prime Minister, John Howard, with his welfare to work legislation. Single mothers with children over 8 years were redefined as, quote, unemployed, and their status as mothers performing crucial care work for the nation rendered irrelevant under the new legislation. This shift from incorporating women as citizen mothers and recognising care work through laws and policies of economic redistribution, including baby bonuses, child endowment payments, state pensions for single mothers, progressive taxation and family payments, has shifted over the last 20 years in the Anglo-American world, with women increasingly incorporated as workers rather than mothers by the state. This shift marks a key shift in policy that the US sociologist Anne Orloff has memorably referred to as a, quote, farewell to maternalism, with mothers being redefined as ostensibly genderless individuals. In this paper, I will examine this shift through the lens of Carol Pateman's classic book, The Sexual Contract, arguing that Gillard's dual political actions, the misogyny speech and signing off on the Fair Incentives to Work bill, is paradigmatic of the new reality. Women are normatively free as individuals. Indeed, they can be prime ministers, but constrained as mothers performing unpaid, unrecognised and unshared work in the private sphere. So I'm going to look now at the single mother's benefit. Introduced by visionary Labor Party Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1973, after extensive lobbying by the newly formed Council for Single Mothers and Their Children, the Supporting Mothers Benefit, as it was then known, allowed women to live on a modest income and raise children outside the institution of marriage. In 1994, for example, when I had my first child as a young single mother, this benefit constituted 35% of the average male wage and therefore facilitated a basic income for separated, divorced and never married mothers. Importantly, like the child endowment payments of earlier, this payment incorporated women as citizen mothers, not as dependent wives or as individual employees, which is what made it such a radical and important benefit. It signalled a society-wide valuing of motherhood and a high level of state support. Although it could be argued that this support was a vestige of earlier incarnations of the welfare state, which valued motherhood within the institution of marriage, it nonetheless provided crucial support and recognition for mothers that was not contingent upon either marriage or employment. This was unquestionably radical and unprecedented. The single mother's benefit was not mutually exclusive with engaging in the labour market, but it wasn't contingent upon it either. And there were generous earning thresholds such that mothers were able to work and earn a modest income before reductions in the benefit commenced, which means that there was an incentive to work that negated the kinds of poverty traps that are common in contemporary neoliberal economies, including Australia, for single mothers and other low-income earners. Earlier welfare payments, such as the Mother's Endowment, later renamed the Child Endowment, extended income to married and single women in recognition of the important work of child-rearing and homemaking. What was even more radical about the single mother's benefit, renamed in 1989 the Sole Parents Pension, and in 1998 Parenting Payment Single, was that it allowed women as mothers to live, even if frugally, outside the institution of marriage. That is, not as wives or workers, the conventional paths to citizenship, but as citizen mothers. In this sense, the single mother's benefit was unique in acknowledging mothering work on its own terms, rather than as a byproduct of patriarchal marriage. It did so by recognising women's difference from men and, in a related sense, the value of mothering. The incorporation of women into the polity as citizen mothers has been severely eroded in the last 15 years from its fragile base as neoliberalism, or what was earlier called economic rationalism, took root in Australia, as it did in the US and the UK. Across the Anglophone world, we have seen a farewell to maternalism, to use Orloff's term, with women's mothering and domestic work increasingly marginalised in policy frameworks. As Jane Jensen explains, quote, "The complement to the male breadwinner model that characterised much of social policy in the 20th century, that is, the stay-at-home mother, is no longer an element of the favoured paradigm. That early model defined women primarily through their roles as carers, for children, for men, for the elderly, for the house. Social policy provided support for women to perform those roles, either directly via, for example, mothers' allowances, survivor benefits and welfare benefits when a male wage was not available, or indirectly by fostering conditions for a high male wage or replacement for it, for example, pensions, unemployment insurance and so on. While there were always variations in access to such benefits and certainly in their generosity, there was a certain consensus that the social norm was the male worker and the female carer, a norm which defined this version of maternalism. Thus, social policy was most frequently designed to allow women, whether living in couples or as lone parents, to conform to this norm. That's why I argue that it's probably that the single mother's benefit as it was set up under Gough Whitlam's government was probably a vestige of this earlier welfare model connected to marriage rather than the kind of radicalism that we're aiming for now in some ways, for a payment to be disconnected from either employment or marriage. However, by the late 1990s, it was replaced with what Jane Lewis and others have termed, quote, the adult worker model. In this perspective, women are no longer excused from participation in the labour force in order to care. They are expected to be able to, quote, reconcile or balance work and family. In effect, motherhood has become what I call an individualised risk, a burden of care no longer supported by state or society. Women perform as much care work as before, but they are no longer acknowledged socially or politically as performing it, since this apparently is sexist. Ironically, in the name of gender equality and women's autonomy, which translates into moving more women into employment, women's unpaid domestic work has been both erased and its costs individualised. The new language of work-life balance and juggling obfuscates the structural incompatibilities between work and home and their fundamentally gendered nature. Similarly, the language of parenting, evident in the revision of the names of welfare benefits, e.g. the single mother's benefit became parenting payment single, also obfuscates who is doing the great majority of the caring. Single mothers constitute between 83 and 87% of single parents in Australia. The figure moves around depending on which year you look at it. In the language of gender equality, in other words, we are consolidating women's oppression. This is the direct result of an unacknowledged sexual contract at the core of the liberal democratic social contract. With the simultaneous decline in marriage and rise in divorce rates, there is now a large and growing group of women and children outside access to a male wage pool, i.e. marriage, cut off from welfare benefits as a consequence of over a decade of austerity across the Western world, and unable to meet ideal worker norms or gain the requisite full-time professional employment to earn not just a wage, but a living wage. This literal no man's land, outside of, yet inextricably defined by, the interlocking institutions of marriage, employment and welfare, is a new space increasingly populated by disenfranchised single women and their children. Farewell to maternalism. In Gillard's rationalisation, the cuts to parenting payments single were undertaken with a view to incorporating women into paid work and ostensibly getting them out of poverty. Laudable goals on the surface. Gillard repeatedly positioned her government on the side of workers, but not in the sense that gave historical gravitas to the Australian Labor Party, with its defence of workers' rights and the establishment of a welfare state. Rather, in the decidedly neoliberal cast of a long hours work culture and the stigmatisation of all those who are unable to secure waged work. In Gillard's own words, quote, "Creating opportunity and enabling social mobility has required different policies in every age. We have moved beyond big government and big welfare to opportunity through education and inclusion through participation. And we have always acknowledged that access to opportunity comes with obligations comes with obligations to seize the opportunity, to work hard, to set your alarm clocks early, to ensure your children are in school. We are the party of work, not welfare. As the historian John Rickard wrote in his biography of Justice Henry Higgins, the first president of the Arbitration Court, social experiments such as arbitration, the 8-hour day, and old age pensions led to Australia being dubbed, quote, the social laboratory of the world. Similarly, Marilyn Lake, in her comparative analysis of early 20th century welfare states, quotes a US official, Henry J. Harris, who was sent to Australia to study our unique system of maternity benefits. Harris observed that Australia was, quote, the first country to institute a system of national aid to relieve the financial burdens of childbirth without requiring some direct contribution on the part of the wage earner. Likewise, Bettina Cass has written that Australia's social security system was atypical insofar as it did not annex welfare payments to participation in the labour market. Rather, they were granted on the basis of citizenship alone, and that's the important piece. This facilitated the establishment of the single mother's benefit and positioned Australian single mothers as unique among women in the Western world, insofar as their mothering was supported directly by the state, not via the institutions or sexual contracts of marriage and or employment. And I've heard the conservative cultural critic Francis Fukuyama call that bureaugamy, so women and the state. As policy analyst David Stanton recently observed, quote, other countries tend to distinguish the type of assistance according to the cause of sole parenthood. One category, goodies, that'd be widows, receive non-means tested social insurance, while the baddies, that'd be single mothers by divorce or who were never married, receive means tested social assistance, e.g. the UK and the USA. The Australian system was quite an achievement. Julia Gillard's ideological orientation attracted critical commentary precisely because it was inconsistent with her party's history, though not, of course, with its present neoliberal orientation. The journalist Brian Toohey noted that, quote, in emphasising hard work, Gillard never gives any hint that she values the labour movement's contribution to reducing working hours, starting with the 8-hour day campaign in the 1850s. Rather, Gillard spoke in a new neoliberal language in which paid work is the only legitimate source of economic and social value. On the one hand, she denies that not all citizens can gain paid work and that unemployment therefore becomes a source of both exclusion and stigmatisation without the safety net of welfare. And on the other, she denies that some citizens, let's call them wives and mothers, engage in non-remunerated work fostering social welfare. In emphasising the dignity of work, by which she means paid work, of course, not unpaid work, Gillard obfuscates and devalues the unpaid work of women everywhere. More perniciously, in cutting welfare from one of the most vulnerable groups in society, single mothers and their children, Gillard reproduced the social contract and together with it the sexual contract, punishing women outside the institution of marriage for failing to conform to masculine norms of autonomy and productivity. This remains the case for single mothers in Australia today and marks a sharp decline in their standard of living, a point we shall return to. Despite the rhetoric about welfare bludgers, most of the mothers who were moved off parenting payments single were already working. Indeed, this transition hit working single mothers the hardest, primarily because the amount that mothers could earn on parenting payments single was significantly higher, in the order of $120 higher, than under New Start or unemployment benefits. Indeed, it was working single mothers who reported losing the most income. Importantly, New Start is one of the lowest unemployment benefits in the industrialised world and hasn't increased in real terms since 1994, or in other words, in 25 years. As mothers slipped through the safety nets, which, as I have written elsewhere, are becoming less about safety and more about surveillance, so too did the understanding that single mothers are at a serious economic disadvantage relative to all other workers, primarily because they're doing unpaid mothering and domestic work. In erasing and negating the unpaid work of women, we are unable to see what makes paid work, especially on the model of the male breadwinner, so difficult for single women with children to achieve. And of course that would apply to women who are in caregiving roles of elderly parents, of disabled or sick children. I mean, you know, I'm using the mother as the paradigm, but there's other ways in which women are doing unpaid care work. Gillard's dilemma. Single mothers are the paradigmatic figure of what Carol Pateman calls the sexual contract, since they fall through the two paths for women's inclusion in citizenship, the traditional path of marriage and the modern path of employment. This is a heuristic division since, of course, women in traditional pre-industrial societies worked, indeed with fewer contradictions than modern women, and women in the working class undertook waged work from the very inception of industrial capitalist society. Nonetheless, the movement of women en masse into the workforce, including merit-based access to all professions, occurred in the later 20th century through a combination of cultural change and changes to the labour market, namely more white-collar service sector jobs and the growth of part-time casual work. And I have had someone express that as when the labour market went shit, women all entered. So, you know, it's complex because the kinds of work women do, and we call it the pink-collar ghetto, tend to be part-time, casualised and so on. Across the Western world, and in the name of equality, government policies also began to support and encourage women's participation in the labour market. In my own analysis on women's position in late modernity that I develop in the book, developed in and through Pateman's theory of the sexual contract, I argue that women are normatively free as individuals, but constrained as mothers, with the peculiar twist that the very freedom women have obtained as individuals comes at the expense of their position as mothers. The two outcomes are inextricably linked. Indeed, I argue they are mutually constitutive. As Pateman clearly shows, the liberal democratic construction of the abstract individual was always already dependent on wives and mothers undertaking the unpaid work of social welfare in the private domestic sphere. This work was both assumed by individuals. Specifically, it was the basis upon which they were both created and sustained, and it was exploited by them. Given that individuals were by definition men in the classical formulation of the social contract and concomitantly in the classical formulation of citizenship, this category has never fully worked for women. While women in contemporary Western societies can more or less function as individuals in their youth, and potentially indefinitely if they choose not to become mothers, after motherhood, contradictions and double shifts routinely emerge. This is precisely why, once women transition to motherhood, the sexual contract returns with force, which is to say serious inequality opens up between the sexes with regards to income, leisure, career status and progress, the domestic division of labour and so on. This chasm doesn't just open, research shows it consolidates and endures, such that the majority of women are permanently compromised in their position as so-called free and equal individuals after motherhood. This is because, as Pateman argues in The Sexual Contract, quote, the individual as owner is the fulcrum on which patriarchy turns. Women's enfranchisement in and through the category of the individual depends on the distinction of public and private spheres, and in turn on the sequestration of what has traditionally been and still remains women's work. Thus, as women enfranchise themselves through the liberal category of the individual, the presupposition, both institutional and structural, is that they are not mothers, or that mothering and wife work more broadly does not intrude on their ostensibly gender-neutral status as workers. This means that in the new sexual contract, as I call it, of late modernity, where all the women are free and equal as individuals, that is, where women have achieved formal, legal and institutional equality, and where this has, after second wave feminism, become a mass phenomenon, they remain primarily responsible for unpaid domestic work and childcare labour, which undercuts a priori their standing as individuals. Popularised as the second shift or the cultural contradictions of motherhood, this problem is not going away, much to the chagrin of the policymakers with their gender-neutral language of people who parent. This is complex. This is a complex problem given that many, if not most mothers, wish to take primary care of children and research. So the liberal feminist answer of putting all the women in the workforce isn't the answer because it's actually not what women necessarily want, and certainly not when they have infants and preschoolers and young children, but potentially not at all. This is a complex problem given that many, if not most mothers, wish to take primary care of children, and research shows have a preference in Australia for part-time work, sometimes constituting only a few hours a week for the duration of their children's dependency, and certainly in infancy and the preschool years. Thus, while we can point to the myriad injustices associated with women's or mothers' structurally compromised position, discrimination in the workplace already evident from pregnancy, the pay gap, the status gap, the double shift and so on, there is also the thorny matter that mothers' preferences are not the same as men's or child-free women's. Most women want to mother, and it is central to their contribution to society. This was, as Pateman perspicaciously put it, Wollstonecraft's dilemma, encapsulated in the two parts to women's citizenship under liberal democracy. As Pateman explains, quote, either women become like men and so full citizens, or they continue at women's work, which is of no value for citizenship, through the right to enter non-discriminatory forms of paid work, to receive equal pay for work of equal value, the right to participate in those forums of power and decision-making in economic and political life from which they remain largely excluded. This is an agenda predicated on the view that appropriate legislation and practices will promote gender-neutral forms of citizenship. The second route consists of women's assertion that as women they have specific talents, capacities, needs and interests which make their expression of citizenship different from that of men. Their unpaid work as carers and providers of welfare provides the moral basis for the conferral of citizenship rights, and that's the kind of paradigm of the maternal citizen, just as men's paid work is central to men's citizenship, end quote. In effect, as Pateman contends, quote, either women become like men and so full citizens, or they continue at women's work, which is of no value for citizenship. So that's of course not her opinion, but she's analysing the ways in which women's work is devalued and the kind of impossible Wollstonecraft's dilemma that women have when they enter into citizenship on the masculine model, which is to say most women end up with a kind of care load and a second shift that is increasingly obliterated in policy discourse. So in modern welfare states where women have won the formal status of political citizenship and are increasingly participating in the labour market, the dilemma of our difference, which I link here to our biosocial capacity for motherhood. Am I still allowed to say biology, Janet? Remains. Importantly, women were excluded from and included in civil society on the same basis, that is, on the basis of being wives and mothers. It was not merely a matter of exclusion, as Pateman points out, but of contradictory inclusion, which is to say we were called free and equal as wives and mothers, which was a position of difference and subjection. In and through the feminist movement across 3 centuries, women have fought for inclusion in the social contract as individuals, and so now women's mothering, their care work in the private domestic sphere, is in turn individualised. Women's structural problems are redefined as personal problems of time management, juggling, and assuming they can or cannot have it all. Women are instructed to opt in and lean out, to take the mummy track or to fight against it, when in reality these seemingly opposite positions are flip sides of the same neoliberal coin. Women now possess contradictory dual selves. That is, they are individuals in possession of liberty and equality, and by that I mean legally and institutionally, and at the same time most are or will become wives and mothers on terms that ensure exclusion and exploitation. This produces double shifts and contradiction for women who simultaneously straddle the categories of free citizen and subjected wives and mothers. This duality is revealed in language that cannot reconcile the mutually exclusive identities, and so we have female leaders and women doctors. Importantly, this would be oxymoronic and absurd when applied to men. Wollstonecraft's dilemma is still with us, and it hinges, I argue, on motherhood, since it is motherhood that recapitulates the sexual contract, even in the late modern polity where women are formally free and equal individuals, which takes us to the very conundrum that bedevilled Gillard's speech. While she was herself treated with contempt, including for being unmarried, Tony Abbott made the outrageously sexist comment that Gillard, who lived with her de facto partner Tim Matheson, should, quote, make an honest woman of herself. She, in fact, recapitulated the sexual contract in using her position of power to hurt the socio-economic position and civil standing of single mothers and their children. Indeed, our first female Prime Minister made it harder, not easier, for women to untangle themselves from the institution of marriage as mothers, producing what I shall call, in keeping with Pateman's nomenclature, Gillard's dilemma. This is to laud the masculine path to citizenship, that of paid work, at the expense of women's mothering and care labour, to encapsulate not simply the two mutually exclusive paths to citizenship, but also to elucidate their mutually constitutive nature. When we promote the unreconstructed category of the female individual, when we claim that women can now work hard and lead nations without including and transforming the repressed sexual contract at its core, we leave women in a state of contradiction at best and, as in the case of single mothers, poverty-stricken and socially excluded at worst. Gillard's misogyny speech demonstrated that women as individuals can now lead nations and speak truth to power, but that to do so without expanding and transforming this category, that would be the category of the individual, is to recapitulate the sexual contract. This is Gillard's dilemma. To this end, I argue, motherhood remains the unfinished business of feminism. We need not only to speak truth to power as individuals, but also as mothers.